Close your eyes for a moment and let your mind drift back almost 1,000 years to a world both familiar and strange. It is the 12th century, an age when faith and empire clashed with a force that would shape continents. Across Europe, banners of the cross were being raised, knights were taking vows, and armies of Crusaders were marching east. Across the Middle East, dynasties struggled for power. Sultans clashed with caliphs, and desert castles stood watch over ancient trade. Roots. This was a world filled with noise, the sound of armies clashing, of swords striking against shields, of priests and imams calling their faithful to prayer. And yet, hidden within that world of kings and empires, there was another power, a power that commanded no great armies, that held no vast lands, and yet could shake the heart of a ruler more than the sight of 1,000 soldiers. It was not a nation, and it was not a dynasty. It was something else, something more elusive and terrifying. To speak its name aloud was to invite unease. That name was whispered by merchants on long caravan roads, muttered by pilgrims on their way to holy shrines, and written in the trembling chronicles of Crusader knights. It was the name of the assassins. The assassins were unlike any other force. Of their time, they did not ride into battle with cavalry charges, nor did they lay siege to cities with catapults. Their strength was not in numbers, for they were always few. Their strength was in precision, in devotion, and in the shadows they cast across the imagination of an age already steeped in fear. To their enemies, they were monsters. To their followers, they were martyrs. And to the world beyond, they became a legend so enduring that the very word assassin still lives in our languages today. But who were they, really? Were they nothing more than killers for hire, blades in the night without loyalty or soul? Or were they part of something greater, a brotherhood bound by faith, a vision of truth carried by a handful of men willing to die for it? To begin to understand, we must look to the man who shaped them, the man whose story lies half in history and half in myth. His name was Hasan-i Sabbah. He was born in Persia, in a world already fractured by war and by faith. The year was around 1050, though no one can be entirely sure. Some accounts claim his family was Shia by tradition, while others say he was raised Sunni before turning to another path. What we know is that from an early age, Hasan was restless. He was drawn to study, not only theology, but mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, all the sciences of his time. He questioned, he argued, he sought truth in a world where truth was always contested. To live in that age was to live surrounded by divisions. The great Seljuk Turks, who dominated Persia, followed the Sunni branch of Islam, while the Abbasid caliphs in Baghdad still held symbolic power, even as their influence weakened. Yet beneath the surface were other groups, persecuted minorities, and hidden sects. Among these were the Ismailis, a Shia community who believed in a living line of imams, heirs to divine knowledge, often concealed from the wider world. Hasan's searching led him toward this Ismaili faith. To follow it in Seljuk territory was dangerous, even deadly, for the Ismailis were seen as heretics, enemies of the state, to be hunted and suppressed. But danger only deepened Hasan's conviction. He became a missionary, a teacher, a man who spread this forbidden creed among those willing to listen. His passion made him a marked man, pursued by enemies, never fully safe. And so he began to dream, not only of faith, but of sanctuary, a place where his people could live free from fear, where their enemies could not reach them. That dream would lead him high into the mountains, to a fortress perched on a sheer rock in the valleys of northern Persia. Its name was Alamut, the eagle's nest. Imagine it for a moment. Steep cliffs rising toward the sky. A stronghold carved into the rock, overlooking fields and rivers far below. To take such a fortress by force would be almost impossible. But Hasan did not need armies. According to legend, he took Alamut not with bloodshed, but with patience and cunning, slowly gaining the loyalty of its garrison until one day, around the year 1090, the eagle's nest belonged to him. From that day forward, Alamut became more than stone and walls. It became the beating heart of a movement. Within its walls, Hasan organized his followers, trained them, and sent them forth into the world. From its high towers, orders were whispered that would change the fate of rulers and empires. And it was here that the legend of the assassins would be born. Beyond the mountains, sultans held glittering courts. Caliphs issued decrees in Baghdad, and Crusader lords plotted behind the walls of Jerusalem. These men commanded thousands of soldiers. They built fortresses. They surrounded themselves with guards and wealth. They believed themselves safe. And yet, none of them slept easily, because the assassins had shown the world something terrifying. No matter how high your walls, no matter how many men you commanded, a single blade carried by a man willing to die could bring it all crashing down. There were stories of rulers waking to find a dagger placed silently by their bedside, a wordless warning that their lives continued only by the grace of the assassins. There were stories of men struck down, in broad daylight, in front of their armies, in the safety of public squares, while their killer made no attempt to escape. In these moments, the assassins proved that their power lay not in surviving the act, but in carrying it out, no matter the cost. Fear became their true weapon. An army might kill thousands, but the assassins killed with purpose, striking not at the masses but at the heads of kingdoms, the hearts of dynasties. A single death could send ripples across a continent, shaking alliances, unseating rulers, breaking the will of enemies who thought themselves untouchable. And as their enemies cursed their name, the stories began to grow. Some claimed the assassins were drugged with hashish, led into secret gardens that mimicked paradise itself. There, they were said to taste pleasures beyond imagination, only to be told that if they died in service, those pleasures would be theirs forever. To their foes, this explained the impossible loyalty of men who would throw away their lives for a single strike. Whether these tales were truth or propaganda is impossible to know. What is certain is that they spread, and with them spread, the legend of a brotherhood bound to both faith and death. Even in their own age, the line between fact and myth was blurred. The assassins wrote little of their own story. Most of what we know comes from their enemies, men who feared them, men who hated them, men who had every reason to paint them as monsters. And so history offers us shadows, fragments of truth, mixed with exaggeration, leaving us to peer into the dark and guess where reality lies. But perhaps that was always the power of the assassins. They lived in the spaces between truth and rumor, in the silence between what could be proven and what was merely feared. Their reputation became larger than life, an invisible army of dread that could cross borders without moving, that could enter palaces without opening gates. In a world of knights and crusaders, of sultans and empires, they remained something else entirely, a whisper that no wall could keep out. Today, the very word assassin carries their shadow. We use it casually, as if it simply means a killer. But behind the word lies the memory of real people, a fortress on a mountain, and a leader whose will turned a persecuted sect into one of the most mysterious forces in history. The assassins terrified kings, intrigued chroniclers, and left behind a legend that has endured for nearly 1,000 years. And this is only the beginning. For as we move deeper into their story, we will enter the eagle's nest itself, the stronghold of Alamut and the life of Hasan-i Sabbah, the man who built an empire of daggers in the shadows of empires. His tale, and the tale of those who followed him, will take us through blood and faith, through myth and truth, to the very heart of why the assassins still haunt our imagination today. The story of Hasan-i Sabbah begins not with armies or fortresses, but with an idea. He was not born into power, nor into wealth. Unlike the princes who commanded soldiers by inheritance, Hasan's strength came from his mind, his conviction, and his ability to inspire others to believe as he did. In a world dominated by the clash of steel, he chose the weapon of faith. And with that weapon, he would carve a place in history far greater than any empire of his time. Accounts of Hasan's early life are blurred by distance. Part history, part legend. He grew up in Persia, a land that had long been a crossroads of empires, filled with scholars, merchants, and warriors. From his youth, he showed a passion for learning. He absorbed knowledge with an intensity that set him apart. Moving from one subject to another, theology, philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, knowledge was his compass and conviction his anchor. But knowledge also made him restless. He sought answers beyond the surface of tradition, searching for meaning in a world where the powerful often twisted faith to suit their rule. His spiritual journey led him to the Ismaili movement, a branch of Shia Islam that believed the true leadership of the Muslim community descended through a line of hidden imams. The Ismailis were a persecuted minority, mistrusted by both political authorities and religious orthodoxy. To join them was not simply a matter of belief, but a matter of defiance. It meant stepping into a dangerous path where suspicion and hostility would follow him. But Hasan was drawn to them with a certainty that seemed unshakable. He not only accepted the Ismaili faith, he devoted himself to spreading it. This devotion would shape the rest of his life. Hasan became a dai, a missionary, one of those entrusted to carry the teachings of the Ismaili Imam into hostile lands. He traveled. He preached. He debated. His words carried weight because he spoke them not as a mere reciter of doctrine, but as a man who lived and breathed conviction. He argued against the power of the Seljuk rulers, who upheld Sunni orthodoxy and sought to crush dissent. He urged people to see beyond the surface of empire and politics, to grasp a truth that was hidden but eternal. And slowly, men and women listened. Slowly, his voice began to gather followers. But the Seljuk rulers were not blind. They saw Hasan's influence growing, and they marked him as a threat. A man of faith could be more dangerous than an army if his words reached the right ears. And so Hasan's life became a constant movement between safety and danger, between hidden supporters and watchful enemies. His search for a sanctuary grew more urgent. He needed not just followers, but a stronghold. Not just words, but a place from which those words could radiate across the land. That search led him to the valleys of Dalam, in the mountains of northern Persia. There, high upon a near-vertical rock, stood a fortress known as Alamut. The fortress had been built decades earlier, perched like an eagle's nest above the valley. From its heights, one could see far in every direction. The walls seemed to grow out of the rock itself, making any assault a nightmare. It was the kind of place that could defy armies, provided it was held with determination. Hasan set his eyes upon Alamut, and knew it was the sanctuary he had been seeking. Yet he had no army to storm its gates. Instead, he relied on patience, persuasion, and strategy. According to tradition, he began by sending his followers to the valley below, slowly spreading their beliefs among the locals. Some accounts even suggest that he gained entry to the fortress itself, quietly converting members of the garrison until his presence was accepted. Whether through diplomacy, stealth, or sheer cunning, by the year 1090, Alamut was his. The fortress changed hands without great battle, but the shift would echo across history. Once within its walls, Hasan transformed Alamut into more than a military stronghold. It became a center of faith, a place of study, a laboratory of strategy. Under his guidance, the fortress housed libraries, schools, and places of worship. It was said that Hasan valued learning above all else, and even as he prepared his followers for missions of life and death, he also urged them to read, to study, to sharpen their minds. Alamut was not simply a hideout. It was a vision of a community set apart from the hostile world outside, sustained by conviction and disciplined by belief. But it was also, undeniably, a place of preparation for a different kind of war. Hasan knew his followers could never stand against the Seljuks in open battle. They were too few, their resources too limited. And so he turned to another form of struggle, targeted, deliberate, psychological. His strategy was not to destroy armies, but to undermine rulers, not to slaughter indiscriminately, but to strike with precision at those who held power. His followers would not fight for plunder or conquest, but for the preservation of their community and the defense of their faith. In this, Hasan's brilliance lay not in the sword, but in the understanding of fear. He realized that one dagger, if placed in the right heart, could achieve what 1,000 soldiers could not. The world beyond Alamut soon began to feel the presence of this new force. Seljuk officials, governors, and military commanders who had threatened the Ismailis began to fall to sudden and shocking deaths. Sometimes it happened in crowded marketplaces, where an assassin would strike boldly before witnesses, knowing he would be cut down immediately after. Sometimes it happened within palaces, in the supposed safety of guards and gates. The message was always the same. No man, however powerful, was beyond the reach of Hasan's followers. It was not only the act of killing that spread fear, but the manner of it. The assassins sought no escape. They struck knowing death awaited them, their mission complete the moment their target fell. This willingness to die unsettled their enemies more than anything else. Armies could be bought off, bandits could be punished, rebels could be crushed. But how do you fight men who do not care for their own survival? The psychological weight of their devotion spread like a shadow across the land. And then there were the rumors. Whispers began to circle about what bound these men so tightly to Hasan's command. Enemies claimed that he used drugs, that he fed his followers hashish, and led them into hidden gardens that imitated paradise itself. There they would experience delights beyond imagination, only to awaken and be told that obedience and sacrifice would return them to that paradise forever. These stories, repeated again and again by hostile chroniclers, gave rise to the very word Hashashin, from which our word assassin is thought to come. Whether these tales were true or false mattered little. What mattered was that they spread. They gave shape to the terror that surrounded Hasan and his order. To his enemies, the assassins were not merely dangerous. They were fanatics, men stripped of ordinary fear, bound by visions and promises beyond reason. To his followers, Hasan was not simply a leader, but a guide to salvation, a man whose commands could lead them to eternal reward. Between these two visions lies the truth. But truth is hard to grasp when the world is clouded with fear and rumor. From Alamut, Hasan directed his order with an iron discipline. He himself lived austerely, abstaining from luxury, even from joy. Chronicles speak of him as a man who tolerated no disobedience, who demanded absolute loyalty, and who punished betrayal without hesitation. His life was marked by devotion to his cause, so intense that even his own family was not spared when they defied his rules. To outsiders, this made him seem harsh, even merciless. To his followers, it made him unshakable, a leader who asked of others no more than he demanded of himself. As the years passed, Alamut became the heart of a network. Other fortresses in Persia and Syria would eventually fall under assassin control, each one a node in a web of influence. Messengers traveled between them, carrying orders, news, and instructions. The assassins were few, but they were spread wide, and their reputation traveled farther than any caravan. Hasan had taken a persecuted sect, hunted and despised, and given it a weapon against extinction. He had made them feared, yet in doing so, he had also planted the seeds of myth. The assassins were no longer merely men with daggers. They became symbols of terror, characters in stories told around fires, the embodiment of dread in the minds of their enemies. And once a group becomes a legend, the line between reality and imagination begins to blur beyond recognition. As Hasan-i Sabbah ruled from his eagle's nest, the world outside shifted and changed. Crusader knights carved out kingdoms in the Levant. Seljuk sultans expanded and fractured. Caliphs in Baghdad continued to claim authority even as their power eroded. In this storm of politics, the assassins moved silently, unseen, yet always present. Their strikes were few, but their impact was vast. The dagger in the dark had become a force equal to armies in the field. And so the stage was set. A hidden order, born of persecution, raised in the mountains, bound by faith, and feared by all who heard its name. Hasan-i Sabbah had created not only a sanctuary, but a legend that would outlive him, spreading across continents, embedding itself in memory, and echoing even into our modern age. Yet the story of the assassins is not only about fear. It is also about the fragile balance between survival and destruction, between faith and fanaticism, between myth and truth. To understand them fully, we must walk deeper still into the heart of Alamut, into the lives of those who carried daggers on Hasan's command, and into the pages of history where rumor and reality intertwine. The tale has only begun, and its shadows are growing darker. High in the mountains of Persia, the fortress of Alamut stood against the sky like the outstretched wings of a great bird. From the valleys below, it seemed unreachable, a crown of stone perched upon a sheer cliff. To climb the path toward its gates was to feel the weight of its walls pressing down, to sense that whoever commanded this fortress commanded not just a place, but a vision. It was here, within its narrow courtyards and stone chambers, that Hasan-i Sabbah shaped his brotherhood. It was here that the assassins lived, trained, studied, and prepared themselves for missions that would change the fate of kings. Life inside Alamut was unlike life anywhere else. The world beyond its walls was filled with the noise of armies, the bustle of cities, and the shifting tides of empire. But within the fortress, time seemed to move differently. Days were ordered, strict, bound by discipline and study. Hasan ruled his mountain home with iron conviction. He demanded silence, obedience, and dedication from his followers. No laughter rang through the courtyards, no songs broke the air, for joy and indulgence were considered distractions from the mission. Those who lived in Alamut lived with a single purpose: to serve the cause of their imam, and to preserve their faith against a hostile world. Hasan himself was the model of austerity. Chronicles describe him as a man who denied himself luxury, who ate simply, who dressed plainly, who tolerated no softness. He expected the same of all who lived under him. The assassins were not to be seduced by wealth or pleasure, for such things corrupted the will. What mattered was discipline, the sharpening of both body and mind. To falter, even slightly, was to endanger the survival of the entire community. Hasan made this clear not only with words but with action. There are stories that he punished, even his own family, when they defied his strict rules, a demonstration that loyalty to the cause came before blood, before comfort, before all else. Yet life inside Alamut was not only hardship, it was also learning. Hasan believed knowledge was as powerful a weapon as the dagger, perhaps more so. He filled his fortress with books, manuscripts, and teachers. Libraries were built, rooms of study prepared, lessons given to those who were willing to learn. Philosophy, science, mathematics, astronomy, and theology were studied alongside training in stealth and endurance. To outsiders, the assassins were mere fanatics, mindless killers. But inside the walls of Alamut, they were also scholars. They debated, they read, they sought wisdom. It was said that the fortress contained texts thought lost elsewhere, preserved, in secret from a world that sought to silence them. Alamut became, in some ways, both a monastery and a military school. A place where faith and knowledge lived side by side. Training for those chosen to carry out Hasan's missions was demanding, and often secretive. The young men who arrived at Alamut were tested not only in strength but in loyalty. They were asked to devote themselves entirely to the cause, to accept death without hesitation, to give up family, wealth, and worldly ambition. Once they entered the path of the assassins, there was no return. They were bound to their brothers and to their leader until the end of their lives. The discipline was absolute, and the cost was high. But those who remained were forged into something rare, men willing to sacrifice everything for a single strike, men whose certainty in their mission made them more dangerous than armies. It is here that legend and rumor wrap themselves most tightly. Around the truth, outsiders, unable to comprehend how such loyalty could be possible, began to imagine hidden forces at work. They whispered that Hasan controlled his followers with visions of paradise. According to these tales, the fortress of Alamut contained a secret garden, concealed behind high walls, lush with flowers, flowing with fountains, filled with scents and pleasures unknown to the barren mountains around it. Within this garden, it was said, Hasan would lead his chosen novices after feeding them a potion laced with hashish. They would awaken surrounded by beauty, attended by maidens, tasting delights that seemed like heaven itself. Then, after a time, they would be cast back into the harsh stone of the fortress, and told that what they had seen was a glimpse of paradise promised to those who obeyed without question, who died gladly for the cause. This story spread far and wide. Crusaders repeated it in their chronicles. Muslim enemies passed it along as proof of the assassin's madness. And even centuries later, it was retold by travelers like Marco Polo. It explained, in the minds of outsiders, why these men were willing to throw away their lives so easily. They were not merely devoted, they were drugged, deceived, and promised heavenly rewards in exchange for their daggers. The very word, Hashashin, meaning users of hashish, was applied to them, and from it the word assassin would enter European tongues. But was it true? Most modern historians doubt it. The assassins left few records of their own, but what evidence we have suggests the story was likely a fabrication, perhaps begun by their enemies as a way of painting them as savages, driven by intoxication rather than belief. In reality, Hasan himself was known for his strict rejection of indulgence. He would hardly have tolerated the use of drugs or pleasures within his fortress. More likely, the loyalty of his followers came not from deception, but from conviction. A conviction so absolute that outsiders could not comprehend it, and so invented fantastical tales to explain it. Yet legends, once told, have power of their own. Whether true or false, the story of the Paradise Garden clung to the assassins, shaping their image in the eyes of the world. For their enemies, it made them seem even more terrifying, for who could reason with men who believed death was the key to eternal bliss? And for their allies, it added to their mystery, making them figures at once feared and admired. Inside the walls of Alamut, life continued with an intensity that few could match. The fortress became not only a sanctuary for the Ismaili community, but also a beacon for those who sought refuge from the persecution of the Seljuks. Families lived within its protection, children grew under its teachings, and the order expanded its influence across the mountains. Other fortresses, once independent, fell under Hasan's control, forming a chain of strongholds that stretched across Persia and into Syria. Each fortress was commanded with the same discipline, each bound to the same cause, each ready to send out men on missions that could alter the course of politics. The assassins did not wage wars of conquest, yet their presence was felt in every corner of the Middle East. Governors who spoke too loudly against them found themselves silenced. Commanders who prepared campaigns against them sometimes did not live to march. Even distant rulers learned to measure their words carefully, for the shadow of the assassins could reach across borders and strike without warning. And still, within Alamut, Hasan remained as unyielding as stone. He rarely left his fortress after seizing it, devoting his entire life to its preservation and to the strengthening of his community. While empires rose and fell beyond the mountains, he remained in his eagle's nest, directing his followers with a quiet but absolute authority. To those who lived under him, he was not only a leader but a symbol, proof that faith and will could defy the mightiest of empires. To imagine life within those walls is to picture a place both harsh and hopeful. Harsh because every day demanded sacrifice, silence, obedience. Hopeful because for those who had lived under persecution, Alamut was a refuge, a place where their faith could be practiced without fear. It was a strange mixture of school, monastery, barracks, and sanctuary, unlike anything else in the world of its time. From this mountain fortress, Hasan built a society that thrived not through conquest, but through resilience. He taught his people that survival itself was victory, and that each act of resistance, no matter how small, was a triumph over the enemies who sought their destruction. In this way, Alamut became more than a fortress. It became a symbol of endurance, of cunning, and of a faith that refused to be silenced. And yet, as the assassins grew in strength, so too did the legends that surrounded them. To their enemies, they were demons in human form, wielding daggers, in the service of madness. To their allies, they were a necessary terror, capable of achieving what armies could not. To the wider world, they became a mystery, half fact, half fantasy. Their story whispered in marketplaces and courts alike. In the centuries since, that mystery has only deepened. We know fragments of their life within Alamut, glimpses of their libraries, rumors of their gardens, echoes of their training. But much remains hidden, lost in the silence of time. Perhaps that is fitting. The assassins themselves thrived in shadow, and shadow is where their legacy still lingers. As we leave the fortress behind for now, the story turns outward. For the assassins did not remain confined to their mountain home. From Alamut, their influence spread across Persia, into Syria, and into the heart of the Crusader states. They would become entangled in the great struggle between Christian crusaders and Muslim rulers, sometimes as enemies, sometimes as unexpected allies. The next chapter of their story would unfold not only in secret missions, but in the grand theater of the Crusades, where kings and sultans alike would learn to fear the dagger of the assassins. The reputation of the assassins did not grow in silence alone. Their power was not in the number of soldiers they commanded or the size of their fortresses, but in the careful, deliberate strikes that shook kingdoms and unsettled the most confident rulers. It was not battles that carved their name into history, but daggers. With each assassination, they made it clear that no man, no matter how high, was beyond their reach. And each time their blade found its mark, the world whispered more fearfully about the eagle's nest. The first of these strikes came at a moment when the Seljuk Empire seemed invincible. Nizam-ul-Mulk, the vizier of the Seljuks, was among the most powerful men of his age. For decades, he had served as the guiding hand behind the empire, shaping policies, commanding armies, and ensuring the stability of his masters. His wisdom was praised, his authority feared. But to Hasan-i Sabbah, the vizier represented a threat too dangerous to ignore. Nizam-ul-Mulk had sought to crush the Ismailis, declaring them heretics and enemies of the faith. He understood, perhaps more than others, the danger posed by Hasan's growing influence, and so the decision was made. In the year 1092, as the vizier traveled on a journey with the Seljuk Sultan, a figure approached him dressed as a humble Sufi. To those around, it seemed an ordinary meeting, nothing to raise suspicion. But when the stranger drew close, steel flashed. With a single stroke, the vizier was struck down. Chaos erupted, but the killer did not flee like a thief. He had no escape plan, no route to safety. He had come prepared to die, and his death mattered less than the terror his action unleashed. Nizam-ul-Mulk, the architect of Seljuk power, was gone, and the assassins had announced their presence on the stage of empires. The shock was profound. It was not only the loss of one man, but the message it carried. The Seljuks, who commanded armies numbering in the tens of thousands, could not protect even their most trusted minister. If such a figure could be cut down by a single dagger, who was safe? From that moment on, the assassins were no longer a shadowy sect hidden in the mountains. They were a force to be reckoned with, feared not for their armies, but for their precision. The pattern would repeat itself in the years to come. Their next great target was another enemy of their faith, a man who had risen to power in Syria and threatened the fragile survival of the Ismailis. His name was Ridwan, ruler of Aleppo, and though at times he showed favor to the sect, his shifting alliances made him unreliable. The assassins struck swiftly, eliminating those who betrayed them. Sometimes even in the heart of mosques, in the crowded markets of great cities, in places where the boldness of the act only magnified the terror it inspired. Their assassinations followed a ritual of precision. The chosen devotee would approach the target not with arrows or poison from afar, but face to face. A dagger carried close to the body would be drawn at the perfect moment. There was no escape, no distance between killer and victim. This intimacy made their acts unforgettable. To kill from afar could be explained as luck or cowardice, but to strike from within arm's reach, in the presence of guards and followers, was a demonstration of both courage and inevitability. It showed the world that the assassins were not afraid of death, that their loyalty to their leader and their cause outweighed their instinct to survive. The Crusaders, too, would feel the edge of the assassins' blades. As European knights carved out their kingdoms in the Levant, they encountered this strange sect that seemed to live between alliances, sometimes aiding the Muslims, sometimes reaching out in truce with the Christians. But whatever their shifting politics, the dagger remained constant. One of the most famous victims was Conrad of Montferrat, a Crusader prince who had risen to power in the late 12th century. He was to be crowned king of Jerusalem, a position that would have made him one of the most influential figures in the Crusader states. But in 1192, as he walked through the streets of Tyre, he was approached by two men disguised as monks. To all who saw them, they seemed harmless, perhaps even holy. Yet as Conrad passed, the monks revealed their daggers and struck. The prince fell, mortally wounded, and the streets erupted in confusion. The killers were captured and executed, but the damage was done. The would-be king was dead, and the assassins had once again demonstrated their reach. The news spread like wildfire through Europe. In distant courts, kings and nobles spoke in hushed tones of the mysterious sect from the mountains of the east. Men who could kill even the most powerful leaders and who accepted death as calmly as others accepted life. For the Crusaders, already struggling against Muslim forces, the knowledge that another hidden enemy lurked in the shadows brought unease. Who among them might be marked next? What fortress, wall, what guard, what sword could protect against a killer who did not fear his own death? The stories of these killings grew in the telling. Chroniclers embroidered them with details, emphasizing the boldness of the assassins, the helplessness of their victims, the inevitability of the dagger. Soon the legend grew so great that even when a ruler died by other means, rumors spread that the assassins had played a role. They became, in effect, the invisible hand behind every mysterious death, their reputation feeding itself, making them appear larger than life. There is a tale told of a time when a powerful leader, hearing of their reputation, dismissed them as mere brigands. According to the story, he later woke to find a dagger planted beside his bed, with a note warning him that the assassins could have taken his life had they wished. Whether this account is fact or embellishment, it captures the essence of their power. They did not always need to kill. Sometimes the suggestion of death, the whisper of a blade in the night, was enough to bend rulers to their will. Their strategy was not random. They did not strike without reason, nor did they seek to spread chaos for its own sake. Each assassination was chosen carefully, aimed at figures whose removal would weaken their enemies or strengthen their own survival. By targeting leaders rather than soldiers, they waged a war of precision rather than attrition. Where other powers spent armies and gold, the assassins spent only a single life, exchanged for another that mattered far more. This was the genius of Hasan-i Sabbah's vision. He understood that his people, small in number and beset on all sides, could never win through conventional war. But by cultivating fear, by making rulers doubt their own safety, he created a form of power that required no armies at all. Every time a vizier, a prince, or a general looked over his shoulder, wondering if the next stranger in the crowd carried a dagger. The assassins had won another victory without lifting a blade, and so the chronicles of the 12th and 13th centuries are littered with the names of men who fell to the assassins. Viziers, emirs, princes, and generals. Each death was both an act of survival and a message to the world. Sometimes the killings preserved their community by eliminating a threat. At other times, they served as warnings, showing that betrayal or aggression would not go unanswered. In both cases, they reinforced the idea that the assassins were untouchable, a force that could not be confronted by ordinary means. The terror of their reputation grew, so great that alliances were formed not only out of friendship but out of fear. Some rulers paid tribute to the assassins, hoping to buy their safety. Others sought their friendship, calculating that it was better to have the dagger pointed away from them than toward their throat. In this way, the assassins achieved influence disproportionate to their numbers, weaving themselves into the politics of the region through the art of selective violence. And still, within the walls of Alamut, their lives continued as before, strict, disciplined, devoted. The assassins who went out to strike rarely returned, but their names were remembered, their sacrifices honored. They were not seen as lost, but as fulfilled, having given their lives in service of a cause greater than themselves. To the world outside, they were fanatics, madmen, who threw away life for the promise of paradise. To their brothers, they were heroes, martyrs, eternal examples of loyalty. This paradox is what made them so terrifying to their enemies. To face a foe who wants to live is one thing. To face a foe who embraces death is quite another. Armies can be broken, fortresses can be stormed, but how do you defeat men who see death as a doorway, not an ending? As their legends spread, even those who never saw an assassin began to imagine them everywhere. Every stranger in a market, every quiet figure in a mosque, every servant in a palace could be one of Hasan's men. Fear magnified their numbers, making them seem far more numerous than they truly were. In truth, the assassins remained few, their actual killers a small fraction of their community. But perception was as powerful as reality. By appearing larger than life, they controlled the thoughts of men as effectively as they controlled their daggers. And so, assassination by assassination, whisper by whisper, the assassins carved their mark into the age. They were never conquerors in the ordinary sense, never rulers of vast empires. Yet they influenced the course of events as profoundly as any king. By choosing carefully whom to strike and when, they guided the fate of battles they never fought, shaped the politics of courts they never entered, and haunted the dreams of rulers who never saw their faces. Their reputation was their greatest weapon, and with each death it only grew sharper. The world would not forget them, and even centuries later, the very word born from their name would carry the weight of fear. The world in which the assassins lived was not one of simple lines drawn between friend and foe. It was a time when loyalties shifted like sand in the desert, when today's enemy could become tomorrow's ally, and betrayal was often only a matter of convenience. In this shifting landscape, the assassins became masters of survival, weaving themselves into the politics of their age not by sheer force, but through a combination of fear, diplomacy, and a willingness to strike when others hesitated. From there, mountain strongholds, they watched the great powers struggle for dominance. On one side were the Seljuks and other Muslim dynasties who sought to crush them as heretics. On another were the Crusaders, foreign invaders who had carved kingdoms out of the Holy Land. Each side mistrusted the assassins, Yet each found, at times, that their own survival required some form of understanding with these elusive killers. There are stories told of how the assassins approached diplomacy in ways as bold as their assassinations. Envoys would descend from the mountain fortresses, not with armies but with words, offering peace to those who showed respect and threats to those who did not. Many rulers came to understand that it was better to live with the assassins as uneasy neighbors than to provoke them into action. And so, paradoxically, their daggers created opportunities for peace, for alliances, for moments of cooperation that seemed unthinkable in such a fractured age. One of the most fascinating examples lies in their interactions with the Crusaders. To most Muslims, the Crusaders were invaders, desecrators of holy lands, enemies of the faith. To the assassins, however, politics was never so simple. They could oppose the Crusaders in one moment, and yet in another find common cause against a mutual foe. At times they offered truce to the Christians, not out of loyalty but out of calculation, and the Crusaders, for their part, often accepted these arrangements. They had seen the daggers of the assassins at work, and they knew the value of having them as allies or, at the very least, as neutral neighbors. One story, often retold, involves the great Crusader King Richard the Lionheart. During the Third Crusade, Richard found himself entangled in the complex politics of the region. Surrounded by enemies, wary of betrayal, he understood that victory required not only swords, but also diplomacy. It is said that Richard opened communication with the assassins, seeking to secure their neutrality, or perhaps even their assistance, in his campaign. Whether the meetings truly took place, as chroniclers described, is uncertain. But the very idea that one of Christendom's most celebrated kings would seek terms with the assassins speaks volumes about their reputation. In another tale, the assassins, Allegedly, offered Richard a form of protection, assuring him that no dagger would ever be turned against him. Some versions even claim that they presented him with gifts as a sign of goodwill, though whether this is legend or fact remains a matter of debate. Still, the story captures the strange position the assassins held. They were feared, yes, but also respected, even courted, by kings who recognized their influence. Nor were these dealings limited to the Crusaders. Within the Muslim world, too, the assassins navigated a dangerous web of alliances and rivalries. At times, they aligned with one dynasty against another, striking selectively to shift the balance of power. In other moments, they sought peace, offering their daggers only as a warning of what might happen if their communities were threatened. They were not reckless. Their violence was calculated, designed to maximize their security with minimal loss of life, by eliminating key figures. They could sometimes achieve with one stroke what armies could not accomplish in years of battle. But diplomacy with the Persians was always a dangerous game. To accept their friendship was to admit vulnerability. To live under the shadow of their power. To reject them was to risk becoming a target. This precarious balance made them both valuable and terrifying. Rulers would sometimes pay tribute to them, not unlike a tax for survival, ensuring that their names would be kept off the lists of those marked for death. Others sought alliances, hoping to direct the assassins' blades against their enemies, rather than themselves. In this way, the sect became not only a military force, but also a political player, shaping events far beyond their numbers. The shifting alliances of the assassins also fed into their growing legend in Europe. To Crusader chroniclers, the sect appeared mysterious, almost otherworldly. They seemed to act without clear loyalty, sometimes attacking Muslim leaders, sometimes Christian lords, always pursuing their own hidden agenda. This unpredictability only deepened the fear they inspired. Stories spread of their secret rituals, of hidden gardens of paradise, of a master who could command his followers to die at a word. These tales, exaggerated though they may have been, traveled across continents, shaping the image of the assassins as more than a sect, more than a political force, as a symbol of the East's most enigmatic and terrifying mysteries. The reality, as always, was more practical than the legend. The assassins needed allies because they were small, surrounded by enemies. Their survival depended on their ability to manipulate greater powers, to create space for themselves in a world that had no place for them. When it suited them, they killed. When it suited them, they made peace. Their loyalty was to survival itself, to the vision of Hasan-i Sabbah, who had taught them that numbers mattered less than resolve, and that the mind could be as sharp as any dagger, yet their diplomacy could not erase the fundamental tension of their existence. No matter how many alliances they made, they were still regarded as heretics by much of the Muslim world, as dangerous fanatics by the Crusaders, and as a sect apart from all others. Their mountain fortresses protected them, but isolation also defined them. They were never fully trusted, never fully embraced. Even when their friendship was sought, it was sought with hesitation, with one hand extended and the other on the hilt of a sword. This isolation was part of their power. They were not bound by the same loyalties as others. They could move between worlds, negotiating with Christians one day and Muslims the next, always placing their own survival above the divisions that consumed others. In an age defined by holy wars, they were pragmatic, willing to shift their stance when it served them. And though this pragmatism made them seem untrustworthy, it also ensured that they endured for centuries while empires rose and fell around them. The assassin's role in this complex dance of politics is perhaps best understood not as that of conquerors, but as survivors. They were never the strongest, never the most numerous, never the wealthiest, but through a combination of fear, diplomacy, and cunning, they carved out a space for themselves in one of history's most dangerous centuries. They proved that survival was not always about strength of arms, but about clarity of vision and the willingness to act in ways others would not dare in time. Their interactions with both Crusaders and Muslim rulers alike would come to define not only their reputation but also their fate. For as their power grew, so too did the determination of their enemies. The alliances they forged were fragile, temporary, and often built on necessity rather than trust. And though the assassins were skilled at survival, the tides of history would eventually bring forces against them that no dagger, no alliance could withstand. For now, however, their story was one of endurance, of adaptability, of the strange friendships born of fear and necessity. They stood apart, their mountain fortresses looking down upon a world in turmoil, their daggers hidden but always ready. To their enemies, they were monsters. To their allies, they were uneasy partners. To themselves, they were the chosen, bound by a vision that had begun in the mind of a single man and spread across empires. And so, as the Crusades raged, as dynasties fought and empires fractured, the assassins endured, carving their own path through history, neither wholly with one side nor the other, but always, in some way, above them all. For nearly 2 centuries, the assassins had survived against all odds. They had endured waves of persecution, wars of religion, and the unending turmoil of the Crusades. Their fortresses stood like eagles' nests in the mountains, perched on cliffs that seemed unassailable, defended as much by fear as by stone. Their daggers had shaped politics, slain kings, and dictated the choices of rulers far more powerful than themselves. Yet, like all things born of history, their time of dominance was not destined to last forever. The seeds of their decline were planted in the very strength that had sustained them. Isolation. For generations, they had relied on the security of their mountain citadels, on the loyalty of their followers, and on the fear they inspired beyond their walls. But as the years passed, enemies learned to adapt. They built larger armies, developed new strategies, and, above all, grew weary of the terror that the sect represented. The assassins, though skilled in assassination and diplomacy, remained few in number. They could not grow into an empire, nor could they expand their territories without provoking overwhelming retaliation. Their strength was fixed, while the world around them continued to change. Within the Muslim world, powerful dynasties shifted and rose. The Seljuks had waned, but new rulers stepped into their place, each eager to prove their strength by defeating the feared sect. Some launched campaigns against them, besieging their fortresses and attempting to root them out once and for all. Though many such attempts failed, each left the assassins weaker, more cautious, more aware that their enemies were relentless. The survival strategy of daggers and diplomacy could only hold so long before sheer numbers and resources tilted the balance. Against them, compounding their difficulties, was the constant suspicion they faced. Too many Muslim rulers, they remained heretics, a dangerous sect that undermined unity. To the Crusaders, they were treacherous and unpredictable, too willing to switch sides, too dangerous to trust. Even when they secured peace through negotiations, those truces rarely lasted beyond immediate necessity. Their allies were fleeting, their enemies enduring. This lack of true, lasting friends left them isolated, hemmed in by hostility on all sides. Still, they endured. Their fortresses remained intact, their leaders continued to wield power, and their assassins continued to strike fear into the hearts of rulers. But even as they survived, the balance of history was shifting. A storm was gathering far to the east, a force unlike any the region had ever seen. It came not from the deserts of Arabia, nor the castles of Europe, but from the endless steppes of Central Asia. It was a storm carried on horseback, its sound the thunder of hooves, its breath the fire of conquest. The Mongols were coming. When the Mongols first appeared on the fringes of the Islamic world, few understood the scale of the threat. At first, they were little more than rumors, stories told by travelers of strange horsemen who could ride for days without rest, who shot arrows with deadly precision, who destroyed cities with an efficiency that seemed almost mechanical. But as the Mongols pressed westward, rumors became reality. Cities burned, kingdoms crumbled. Entire populations vanished in a storm of blood and ash. The world began to understand that this was no ordinary foe. For the assassins, the arrival of the Mongols was both a distant warning and an immediate danger. At first, they observed cautiously, watching as the horsemen swept across Persia, crushing dynasty after dynasty. They may have believed that their mountains would protect them, that their fortresses were too remote, too impregnable to attract the attention of the Khans. But this was a dangerous illusion. The Mongols were unlike any enemy they had ever faced. They did not fear daggers. They did not believe in diplomacy or truces. To them, terror was not a deterrent, it was a weapon. They wielded themselves with unmatched cruelty. Stories of Mongol cruelty traveled quickly. And they were no mere exaggerations. Cities that resisted were utterly annihilated. Populations were slaughtered or enslaved. Libraries, mosques, palaces, all were reduced to rubble. The Mongols left behind nothing but ruins, a warning carved into the land itself. To many, they seemed less like men and more like a force of nature, an unstoppable tide that swept away all who stood in its path. For the assassins, who had long relied on their ability to terrify others into submission, this was a chilling realization. How could fear work against an enemy that had perfected it far beyond anything they themselves had imagined? As the Mongols advanced, the assassins attempted their old strategies. They plotted assassinations, sending their followers to strike at Mongol generals, hoping to sow discord in their ranks. But these efforts achieved little. The Mongols, hardened by endless campaigns, were not easily shaken. Their leaders traveled with strict security. Their discipline was unshakable, and their vengeance was absolute. Each failed attempt at assassination only provoked greater wrath. The Mongols responded not with caution, but with overwhelming destruction. The balance of terror that had once favored the assassins now tilted against them. For centuries, they had relied on the belief that no ruler was safe, that their daggers could strike anywhere, at any time. But against the Mongols, that belief crumbled. The horsemen did not tremble. They did not negotiate. They did not care. For the survival of a sect tucked away in mountain fortresses, where others had hesitated, the Mongols acted. They would not live under the shadow of fear. They would erase the shadow altogether. In this moment, the assassins faced the greatest test of their existence. The mountain fortresses that had once seemed eternal were suddenly fragile. Their isolated position, once their strength, now became their weakness. They had no vast armies to counter the Mongols. They had no great allies to defend them. Their daggers, so sharp against individual rulers, were useless against the tide of tens of thousands of horsemen sweeping across the land. For the first time in their history, their survival seemed not merely uncertain, but impossible. The story of the assassins had always been one of survival, of outlasting greater powers through cunning and terror. But now they faced an enemy who knew no fear, who could not be manipulated, who sought nothing less than total domination. The Mongols were not just another dynasty, not just another empire. They were a storm that erased borders, faiths, and histories alike. To stand against them was to face annihilation. And yet, as the Mongols drew nearer, the assassins did not surrender easily. Their leaders still believed in the strength of their vision, in the loyalty of their followers, in the walls of their fortresses. They prepared for siege, trusting in the mountains that had always shielded them. But even the highest peaks could not withstand the storm forever. The time was coming when the assassins would face their final reckoning, and the world would learn whether daggers and fear could prevail against the most fearsome army in history. The storm that had long rumbled on the horizon finally broke over the mountains of Persia. By the middle of the 13th century, the Mongols had already swept through Central Asia, annihilating entire kingdoms and leaving behind smoking ruins as monuments to their power. The great Khwarezmian Empire had been reduced to dust, its cities erased as if they had never existed. The Caliph of Baghdad himself would soon fall before the relentless tide, and nestled in their isolated fortresses, the assassins, so long feared by kings and caliphs now, found themselves facing the one enemy they could neither intimidate nor outlast. At first, there was disbelief. The assassins had endured so many enemies before. The Seljuks, the Crusaders, rival Muslim dynasties had tried to wipe them out, and each had failed. Their castles perched on impossible cliffs had defied siege after siege. Their assassins had struck down leaders who underestimated them, and their diplomacy had often bought them time to recover. But the Mongols were different. They did not see the assassins as a rival to negotiate with or a nuisance to tolerate. To them, the sect was nothing more than an obstacle in the path of conquest, and obstacles were to be destroyed. The first encounters were brutal. When Mongol envoys were assassinated on the orders of assassin leaders, the retaliation was swift and merciless. The Mongols, unlike other powers, never tolerated such an insult. Their vengeance was total. Villages suspected of harboring sympathizers were razed. Populations were massacred without hesitation. The message was unmistakable. The daggers that had once ruled through fear now carried only the promise of annihilation. Fortress after fortress came under Mongol siege. The assassins had long believed their castles impregnable. Built high in the mountains, surrounded by sheer cliffs, supplied with secret water sources and hidden granaries, these citadels were designed to withstand years of siege. Against traditional armies, they had succeeded, but the Mongols were masters of siege warfare. They brought with them engineers from conquered lands, Chinese specialists skilled in building trebuchets, catapults, and siege towers. They hauled massive war machines across mountains, constructing them piece by piece if necessary, until even the remotest fortresses found themselves under bombardment. The skies above once secure, strongholds filled with fire and stone. Walls that had endured generations of assault began to crack. Towers collapsed. The assassins, who had always counted on time to wear down their besiegers, now discovered that time itself was against them. The Mongols never tired, never relented, never accepted stalemate. They came not for compromise, but for extermination. Inside the fortresses, desperation grew. The faithful had once believed that Alamut and its sister castles were eternal, that they were sanctuaries blessed by divine protection and sustained by the wisdom of their leaders. But as Mongol weapons thundered against the walls, even the most devout began to question. Supplies dwindled. Morale faltered. The daggers that had once given them power now lay idle, useless against the avalanche pressing down from the steppes. The fall of Alamut, the jewel of the assassin state, marked the turning point. For nearly 2 centuries, Alamut had been more than a fortress. It was the heart of their order, the seat of their leaders, the library of their knowledge, the symbol of their endurance. But in the year 1256, the Mongols came for it with the full force of their empire. Hulagu Khan, brother of the great Khan, led the campaign himself. His army surrounded the stronghold, cutting off every path of escape, every hope of relief. Inside, the assassin leader at the time, Imam Rukt, Alden Korshar, faced the impossible. He had inherited not just the leadership of a sect, but the weight of centuries of survival. Yet against the Mongols, he saw no hope of victory. With little choice, he sought negotiation, sending envoys to plead with Hulagu, hoping to buy mercy through surrender. But Hulagu was not a man to be swayed by words. He demanded unconditional submission. The daggers of the assassins, once symbols of terror, had no power here. In December of that year, the unthinkable happened. Alamut surrendered. The gates that had withstood countless enemies were opened. The fortress that had seemed eternal was given over to the Mongols. What followed was devastation. Hulagu ordered the libraries and archives burned, erasing centuries of knowledge in a single act of fire. Priceless manuscripts, astronomical works, theological texts all reduced to ash. The towers were dismantled, the walls broken. The seat of assassin power was not merely captured, it was annihilated, as though Hulagu intended to erase its very memory from history. Other fortresses soon followed. One by one, the citadels that had been the backbone of the order were besieged and destroyed. Some surrendered quickly, knowing resistance was futile. Others held out as long as they could, only to meet the same fate in the end. Entire communities vanished, their inhabitants slaughtered or scattered. The sect that had once controlled vast stretches of Persia was reduced to fragments, survivors fleeing into hiding or disguising themselves among the general population. The fall of the assassins was not only a military defeat, but also a psychological collapse. For centuries, they had been the embodiment of fear, their reputation enough to cow rulers into submission. But the Mongols reversed the equation. Now it was the assassins who trembled, their fortresses shattered, their power extinguished. Even their name, once so terrifying, now evoked only the memory of ruin. Yet not all was entirely lost. Pockets of resistance remained, scattered across distant mountains, small cells that clung to the traditions of their ancestors. These remnants survived in remote corners, hiding from Mongol wrath, waiting for an age when they might rise again. And indeed, in later centuries, echoes of the assassins would resurface, their lineage carried on by communities who preserved fragments of their beliefs. But the era of their dominance, the age when their daggers shaped the fate of empires, was gone forever. The destruction of the assassins by the Mongols was part of a larger tragedy that swept across the Islamic world. Within a few short years, Hulug's armies would march to Baghdad itself, ending the Abbasid Caliphate in a storm of fire and blood. The Mongols, who had spared nothing in their path, seemed destined to unmake the very fabric of the world. In such an age, even the assassins' masters of survival, prophets of terror, proved powerless. Their end was swift, brutal, and final. A reminder that no fortress is eternal, no dagger sharp enough to cut through the tide of history. And as the smoke of Alamut's libraries drifted into the sky, the world knew that an old chapter had closed, and a new, darker one had begun. Long after the walls of Alamut had been torn down and its libraries reduced to ash, the memory of the assassins refused to fade. The Mongols had sought to obliterate them completely, to erase not only their power but their very existence. Yet, history has a way of preserving shadows, and sometimes the echoes of fear last longer than the source of terror itself. The assassins, though broken as a state and scattered as a community, lived on in memory, in rumor, and in legend. Travelers and chroniclers carried their story far beyond the mountains of Persia. Crusaders returning to Europe spoke of a sect, of fanatics who killed without fear, who obeyed their leader with absolute devotion, and who would sacrifice themselves without hesitation to strike down their targets. To Western ears, the tales sounded almost unreal. The very word assassin entered the languages of Europe, not simply as the name of a sect, but as a common term for any secret killer. Centuries later, when we used the word assassin to describe a murderer of the powerful, we unknowingly echo the name of that vanished order. Their legacy endures every time the word is spoken, but the reality was always more complex than the legend. Much of what the world believes about the assassins was filtered through the writings of their enemies. To the Crusaders, they were exotic and terrifying, a people who seemed to defy the natural instinct for survival. To rival Muslim rulers, they were heretics, rebels who struck from the shadows. And to the Mongols, they were little more than a nuisance to be crushed. Few had reason to describe them with fairness, and so their reputation became exaggerated, wrapped in myth, and embroidered with fear. Stories grew wilder with each retelling. Europeans whispered that the assassins were drugged with hashish before being sent on missions, their senses dulled to pain, their minds enslaved by The truth of this has never been proven, but the rumor gave rise to one of history's most persistent myths. Even the name Hashashin, perhaps once a term of scorn used by enemies, was twisted into the word assassin. Thus, the sect's very identity became forever tied to a story they may never have claimed for themselves. Yet beneath the rumors, there was a deeper truth. The assassins represented the desperation of a minority sect struggling to survive in a hostile world. They were Ismaili Shiites in a region dominated by Sunni orthodoxy, surrounded by powerful dynasties that sought their destruction. Their methods were born of necessity, their daggers the weapons of those who could never hope to match their enemies in open battle. And though history remembers them as killers, they were also builders of fortresses, preservers of knowledge, and guardians of a fragile community. For nearly 2 centuries, they held their ground against forces far stronger than themselves. That, too, is part of their legacy. In the centuries after their downfall, remnants of the assassin community survived quietly in Persia, Syria, and later in India. Under new guises, they adapted to changing times, preserving elements of their faith while abandoning the politics of the dagger. Today, their spiritual descendants live peacefully as part of the Nizari Ismaili community. A reminder that even the most feared of sects can evolve into something enduring and constructive. The modern Ismaili faith, with millions of followers worldwide, bears little resemblance to the violent reputation of its medieval ancestors. Yet it carries the thread of continuity that links back to those mountain fortresses. Meanwhile, the image of the assassins took on a life of its own in culture and imagination. Medieval travelers like Marco Polo described them in lurid detail, speaking of secret gardens where initiates were drugged and shown visions of paradise so that they would willingly die for their leaders' commands. Whether these tales were truth or invention hardly mattered. They captured the imagination of generations. Artists, poets, and later historians repeated the stories until the line between reality and legend was lost. Even in the modern era, the assassins have never truly left the stage of imagination. They appear in novels, films, and video games, depicted as shadowy warriors, masters of stealth, and guardians of ancient secrets. While these portrayals often bear little resemblance to historical fact, they testify to the enduring fascination with the idea of a hidden order, moving unseen, shaping the destiny of empires from the shadows. The assassins, in this sense, became larger than themselves symbols of rebellion, mystery, and the hidden power of conviction. There is also something strangely universal in their story. Across cultures and across ages, people are drawn to the notion that the mighty can be humbled, that a dagger in the night can topple a throne, that no ruler, however powerful, is ever truly safe. The assassins embodied that idea, not only in the 13th century, but in the human imagination ever since. Their methods may be condemned, but their reminder that power is never absolute remains unsettlingly relevant. As we reflect on their history, it is worth remembering both the darkness and the light. They were ruthless, yes, but they were also survivors. They spread fear, but they also preserved knowledge. They were destroyers, but they were also creators of communities bound together by faith and loyalty. In their rise and fall, we see the dual nature of humanity itself, the will to endure, the temptation of power, and the endless struggle to find meaning in a world of shifting empires. The ruins of Alamut still stand today, high in the Elburz, mountains of Iran. Visitors who climb its slopes find little more than crumbling stones, foundations that hint at walls long vanished, and a view that stretches endlessly across the valleys. Yet standing there, it is not hard to imagine the banners of the assassins fluttering in the wind, the watchmen scanning the horizons, the hidden gardens that may or may not have existed behind those walls. The silence of the place is a reminder of how even the most formidable powers can fade into whispers. But it is also a testament to the endurance of memory. For though the stones have fallen, the story has not. And so, as night settles and the tale draws to its close, we are left with the image of a people who dared to challenge the empires of their time, who believed that faith and fear could be wielded like weapons, who built fortresses on mountains and tried to carve a sanctuary against the tides of history. They succeeded for a time, and then they were swept away. But their legend has outlived them by centuries, carried in every language that speaks the word assassin, in every story of secret orders and hidden daggers, in every imagination drawn to the mysteries of the past. The assassins remind us that history is not only written in the grand chronicles of kings and conquerors, but also in the shadows, in the lives of those who fought from the margins, who endured as long as they could, and who left behind echoes too powerful to silence. Their time is gone, but their story endures, a lingering whisper in the corridors of history, a shadow that refuses to die. Thank you for joining me on this journey through history. This has been the Bedtime Historian, where the past comes alive to guide you into rest. If you enjoyed tonight's story, please like, share, and subscribe for more calming tales of history. Until next time, sleep well and good night.